introduce you to our keynote speaker, Larry Goodman, for this panel on the Free Market Roadshow. And the issues actually that we picked this year was a transatlantic view on economics, finance, and governance. And after Larry's keynote, we will hear from Daniel Kadik from the European Liberal Forum, from Dr. Franz Wenzel from AXA Insurance, and from Dr. Michael Jäger from the European Economic Senate, not only their views and their comments, but of course their ideas and maybe criticism on what is happening on the front of monetary policy on the other side of the pond in America. But only maybe, we never know. And to provoke you and also to put you out of balance, I'm just counting up a couple of libertarian values that you might agree on or not. And we will discuss that tomorrow at the end of the conference, if some of them are truly libertarian, pro-market just, or if they are Austrian values, or if they are general values that we should all live upon. So I would say independence, self-confidence, take your own into actions, responsibility within the family, believe in voluntary actions, non-intervention in your neighbor's issues, tolerance towards people who are different, and mistrust against power and authority. So maybe just some food for thought, and let's see if the gentlemen here on the floor are able to tie those values into their presentations or into the points of discussion. Nonetheless, I would say, I think we all believe in competition, achievement principle, and self-responsibility as the common denominator. So let's see if Dr. Goodman has the same ideas. Thank you.
Barbara asked me to speak a little bit about lessons for today from Bretton Woods yesterday. The last 11 years have been extraordinary. The last 11 years have been extraordinary from an economic perspective, and they've been extraordinary from a government intervention perspective. Never before have we seen the size of the monetary base or central banks, the Federal Reserve and the ECB, grow as rapidly as they have. We've also seen an increase in regulations in the financial services industry, for sure. And we've also seen financial market distortions grow in various different places. We do live in unprecedented times. Hence, study, history serves as a very useful guide. And for the Center for Financial Stability, the organization that I'm a part of, Bretton Woods has come to be a particular historical lesson that has been uniquely helpful for us. My friend and colleague, Kurt Schuler, found the original Bretton Woods transcripts in the library of the U.S. Treasury Building. He spent a year of his life meticulously editing and annotating those transcripts. We learned a lot about how that agreement was shaped. We then subsequently hosted a 70th anniversary of that agreement. And then in Washington a few weeks ago, coincident with the IMF and World Bank meetings, we hosted an event thinking about the past, but also using the past to think strategically about the future of the international monetary system. We were delighted, thrilled, and honored that Barbara Kolm participated, as well as Robert Holzman. What is the magic of Bretton Woods? What is its importance for today? I'll throw out a few ideas. Bretton Woods provided international monetary rules, a system of rules. This provided discipline. It provided discipline to the system. Bretton Woods also created two important institutions that live to this day, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Also, Bretton Woods, in my mind, especially after reading the transcripts, offered us long-term vision. The framers of that agreement had long-term vision. And I'll share with you one quote from the head of the Norwegian delegation, Willem Kielhel. He said during the negotiations structuring the International Monetary Fund, he mused, this fund we're creating may be with us for hundreds of years. Well, he's on track. This is the 8th decade. Today, policy is overwhelmingly short-term focused. And quite frankly, it's threatening the health and stability of the long term. There are 3 areas in particular that spring from the lessons that we've learned from this work. The first is that extraordinary monetary policy is beyond its limits. Central bank balance sheets, as I've mentioned, have expanded rapidly with a short-term focus. And the reality is that the short-term interventions have had an impact on the long-term health of the financial system. When you look at the liquidity injections that took place in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, there was a liquidity injection and quantitative easing 1. Those exercises were helpful. Quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3 became, from our perspective at least, superfluous exercises. We can look at this and judge this based upon numbers, based upon data. The Center for Financial Stability, my colleague Bill Barnett, creates monetary data. And it's monetary data from a wide range of sources with interesting mathematics behind it. And what we've learned from this data is that the efficacy of monetary policy has in fact diminished with each successive round of quantitative easing. So with each dollop of QE2 and QE3, our indicators actually went in the other direction. So as the Fed put more money into the system, and our indicators measure the private sector, we measure the monetary transmission mechanism. And with each of those dollops, the opposite effect actually happened. I would be willing to bet that a similar phenomenon exists with the ECB. We just don't have the data. Second, this has created a series of spillovers. When one central bank eases, another feels that they need to do so as well, which creates almost this beggar thy neighbor dimension surrounding currency policies. This also ultimately pushes currencies lower, but it leads to a succession of pushing interest rates lower as well. It is no wonder that $17 trillion of sovereign debt is now negative. The interest rates are negative. This is a mess. It leads to distributional changes that are clearly suboptimal. It leads to distortions in financial markets. Third, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, remains at the heart of the financial system for nearly 8 decades. The IMF has done extraordinary work. The IMF is an extraordinary institution. The IMF is engaged in 189 countries around the world. Yet, as the world is becoming increasingly complex, there's the risk of mission creep. Let me give you an example. The IMF's mission is threefold: to provide macro advice and engagement, to provide balance of payments financing if needed, and to provide technical assistance. But what's happened, when you look at the IMF's priorities today, they include financial inclusion, debt transparency, fintech, gender, and climate. I'm not making a value judgment on those items. Those are all perfectly good items to explore, study, and engage in. However, they contrast with the mission of the organization. So that's one of the other findings that we've come to. The conclusion, the summary of this is, well, what do we do? The international monetary system should move over time to a rules-based system. Second, policy actions today would benefit from a more system-wide analysis. And we can go into that, but a more system-wide analysis, the impact of one country on the other, as well as a longer-term perspective. Policies must be promulgated with thinking around a longer-term perspective. And third, it's time for the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, to exercise greater leadership and avoid mission creep. So these positive attributes cannot be achieved overnight. And I'll also reference Kurt's new book, which is fantastic. It's called Before Bretton Woods, the Atlantic City Conference. So it's the conference before the conference. The upshot, the conclusion of that is that it takes time to promulgate good long-term economic policies. And that's very clear in Kurt's work. So it's groups like this that are thinking about issues, thinking about the long-term health of issues, reflecting on history that is so important. So I thank Barbara for all of her good work and the good work of the Austrian Center, and I thank you for your time and attention. Give it a day.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. As you know, we called this session especially, or dedicated this session to the Free Market Roadshow. As you know, the Free Market Roadshow is a conference tour that is touring in Europe only 40 countries. So we go from Spain until Ukraine and Georgia, and from north to south, and many of you who are here are our local hosts and partners. And as for those who do not know, because we have only brought, thanks to Federico Fernandez, we have brought the roadshow to Latin America as well for a couple of times, and of course to the United States. But we always have somebody speaking to either contradict the Austrian thought or to provoke those who are on the panel. And I think Larry has done a great job, because it's the task of the three gentlemen to either find good arguments pro or against, and tying in, and this is the art of the dispute, tying in their current topics, what is happening on this side of the continent, and by doing so, by tying in what is happening in Europe, I would like to start with Franz, and then ask Michael, and then to wrap it up from the guy who is sitting on the shining city, not on the hill, but in Brussels, where all the planning is being done, Daniel. So Franz, the floor is yours.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. It was a very interesting speech from Lawrence. We tend to agree with the initial statement that indeed QE, or all the various forms of QE, had a diminishing impact on presumably growth. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. Yet, we think that at this juncture, the US Federal Reserve has presumably no intention to lower or to decrease its balance sheet, as it has reverted back to what we usually call in our jargon a normal monetary policy, i.e. interest rate policy. So presumably the QE on the balance sheet is of less importance as of today. In particular, as I said, for the US, as they moved into a normal policy. Flipping that over the Atlantic Ocean back into our camp, what takes us, and what keeps us awake night and day is basically the ECB is in a very different situation. Now let's wind the tape back a couple of years. We all in this room remember the famous whatever it takes. And we think back then this was a necessity to help the euro to survive. We should not forget that The entire effort of the euro, or where we stand today, was basically made to guarantee peace. So keeping the euro alive was not only a wish, but it was a necessity. Today, we have a very different problem in the sense that, and Mr. Draghi mentioned that each and every meeting of the ECB, the governments have to play the game as well. And central bank is helpful, it is sufficient, it's necessary, but not sufficient. We need governments, as I said, to play the role as well, i.e. to foster structural reforms. And that's what the Eurozone in particular is suffering as of today. And you can quote any country in the Eurozone which is lacking structural reforms. I'm German by origin, so let me shout and yell against Germany. There is basically not enough effort to quell what is happening in the US, or at least to live up to the limits of what is happening in the US or in China. That is our biggest problem as of today. So it's not that much about monetary policy, but I think you referred to the question of having basically monetary policy and other levers. I don't think you mentioned fiscal policy, but to our understanding, or structural policy efforts, that is basically what is required and what is substantially and desperately, unfortunately, missing as of today. With that, I would like to hand back to Barbara to chair. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. What I wrote down, we need governments to foster structural reforms. And without further ado, I hand this over to Michael. I think he has some thoughts on that.
Yes, some thoughts, and that makes me very angry because I come from Bavaria and Germany, and so we are really a good example how not to run a government. And if you see what is happening now with this basic pension discussion, there's a treaty of socialists and the Conservative Party. They don't follow this treaty, and so I have to pay my taxes, and there's a bill that's written a certain amount. I have to pay this amount. And there's a treaty of the government, and they do not have to fulfill it. And that makes me very angry. And the same problem on the European level, indebtedness. So the crisis of Europe is not a crisis or lack of revenues. It's the misuse of taxpayers' money. We have increasing debts. We have low interest rates. Germany is paying less and less interest rates, but we still have 2,000 billion indebtedness. So it's going a little bit down, but not because of the success of our politicians, it's of the success of entrepreneurs, because we are still strong in Germany, and that's what people misunderstood. And we do a lot of how to say, good meaning people. If it comes to climate, we talk about this carbon dioxide taxation, which will not minimize 1 milligram of carbon dioxide. It brings money to our finance minister. If you would love to reduce carbon dioxide, you must trade certificate. It's a global discussion also with the US. If you want solutions, if you don't only do it in Europe, it's the wrong approach. And it's in Germany it's called Ablasshandel. I cannot translate it. So you pay something to be free, like in church in former years. You did something wrong, you paid a certain amount, and I did something for society, and it's the wrong approach. And so we misuse the money. We have more and more revenues. We did a research with the European Taxpayers Movement. I'm Secretary General of this association too. And if you go to our webpage, taxpayers-europe.org, you find some arguments against European Commission and what is also von der Leyen proposing now, also against digital tax. Can you imagine that we discuss in Europe a tax on sales, not on the success of a corporate? We discuss a taxation only of sales. So if you have a profit, for sure, I love to minimize my tax pressure, but it's clear that we have to finance the state, but we have to discuss the size of governments, the size of public administration. That's what we don't do. Now in Germany and Europe, we open the money pocket, We are discussing minimum wages. We have already in 22 countries. So it's a lie of some political parties if they say we need minimum wages because we have it. For sure, it's different in Romania to Germany, but the living costs are also different in these countries. And I had a meeting 2 weeks ago with the Journalist Association. A very interesting lady said, yes, minimum wages, but it's the same level in each country. So why anybody, I love Munich, but I love Timișoara too, zero unemployment, higher salaries as in other parts of Romania. Why should one person, one investor go to Romania or Bulgaria if you have the same costs, the same taxes, no competition, and you have a weaker administration, you have corruption, and you have a weaker infrastructure? Then we have to pay transfer payments. We have to open the money pocket, and that's on the European level now in discussion. And that's what we have to fight together. We are in favor of competition, and I love to see what is going on now with the Brexit. I dislike that they leave, but they will cut down taxes because they want investment, foreign direct investment. And what is happening in the US, nobody is telling the truth in Germany, that for sure there's a follow-up and there is growth faced to the tax cuts for corporates. For sure. But it's not written in Germany because we have more or less left-wing journalism. There's no transparency. I don't have to comment Trump's politics. That's not my job. But if I look to the results, and if you look to the problems, he really pointed out that if we export to US, we have less taxes or toll, and if cars come to Europe, they have 10%. It's not fair deal. So there's, in some parts he is right, and I'm in favor of competition. I think we should really learn from each other and put pressure on all politicians who want to harmonize taxes, who want to harmonize pension systems. It's a wrong approach. If you look in this room, different ties, different dresses, beautiful dresses of the women. I dislike that everybody is dressed in the same way. It's your choice. So do the right choice with the politicians whom you elect in future, and read the programs. I really ask you, read the programs. Otherwise, it's a nightmare if you wake up later after the election. Thank you.
Well, there is an issue. Do we have an alternative to democracy? Daniel.
Thank you very much for that question, which I will not answer. Let me rather stick to the question that was posed to the panel. And I might live in Brussels. I might be part of the Brussels bubble, but I'm not a big fan of what's happening at ECB, to say the least. I was strongly advocating in Germany when the bazooka was brought out of the shed to blast the problem in Greece, to actually do that. I think it's a fallacy to do that. And it's not only a massive market distortion, and it's not only socializing problems and privatizing gains. It's not only, well, diminishing completely the basic logics of loaning, basic logic of markets to a large extent, not only getting away with risks, investment and gains, but it's also building up, and I think I'm not alone here in the room, building up a massive bubble, which we all are expecting to burst. We had a meeting with a couple of friends from the banking sector this week in Brussels, and we are all quite astonished that the bubble still has not burst. We're still waiting for it to happen. Every day that we wait longer, the risk becomes bigger. But that's not the only problem. What the ECB did, and European politicians and Mr. Draghi did, also is something else. And that is killing banks as a social institution, which I find extremely dangerous. Banks as a social institution that were responsible for security of money of the people. Is money secure now? I would doubt it. The saving mechanism of banks. We have now negative interest for loaner, for people who brought their money to the bank, who wanted to save money. Now and that's the third problem, are rather inclined to loan money for spending. And that is another different and very dangerous problem, which is true for the public and the private sector together. So there is a debt clock that is rolling stronger also for the private sector and not only for the public. And this is for a large extent, and now I'm going into the direction that was discussed earlier, the entanglement of politics and economics. Lawrence mentioned the issue earlier as well, and I just want to point to the pretense of knowledge that is unfortunately very prevalent both in Brussels and in the member states. You only think in absolutes. Only absolutes exist. There is no shading of gray anymore. There's no trying to solve a problem long term. No, we need a solution now, and needs to be the absolute solution. And any discussion about any other solution is impossible. Talking about different solutions on climate change, for instance, then building what we call in German Verspargelung der Landschaft, asparagusization of the environment with wind farms. There are alternatives to that, but they cannot be discussed because there is a certain bias that we have, because people think they have figured everything out, and that's quite a big problem. And this is also true, and that is a topic that I actually wanted to talk about, for trade. I'm a very big fan, and not everybody in the Austrian school is a fan of Bastiat. I am, because there's a very famous quote, if goods can't cross borders, soldiers will, slightly paraphrased. And this is something that we see problematic now, because we see, again, entanglement of politics and economics. It would be a no-brainer having a free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. There would be massive welfare gains, and I will come to that in just a second. But what is discussed now under the potential new administration of Ursula von der Leyen, that the Paris Accord is connected to any future trade deal that will be there in the future. And I don't tell you a secret if I tell you that the current US administration is not the biggest fan. And I'm also not telling you a big secret that this administration is going to stay for another term, even though certain people in the media would like to see it differently. But if you look at the indicators and the numbers, it will stay. So instead of using that tool for enhancing trade and collaboration, it is not there anymore. I mean, we have 1.3 trillion US dollars in trade between the US and the European Union at the moment. But now we have increased tariffs of 7.2 billion that have been imposed on what? On aircrafts and wine. Why? Because people think it is good to start a trade war over certain issues. But we could gain annually 119 billion per year on the EU side, 95 billion per year on the US side. That means 545 euros per family in Europe, just in gains by reducing non-tariff trade barriers and tariff trade barriers with the United States. On the US side, it's 655 per family. That's a lot. And not only high-income families would gain from that, but especially low-income families would gain from that. And not even talking about the advances that we would make in cooperation and research, technology, and the big elephant in the room, China. If we don't solve things now, there is somebody else who's very happy to set international standards if the US and the European Union or Europe are not doing that. So, finalizing it with values that Barbara mentioned in the beginning, there's a very clear value in that, and that is cooperation. Not treating cooperation and trade like the President Trump is doing that at the moment as a win-lose situation, but as we do that here with our Austrian friends as a win-win. And therefore, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Daniel. This could almost be closing remarks, but I'm going to still provoke you a little bit more, or at least try to. I want to bring in the number of insolvencies that we have seen and the zombie businesses that we have seen in Europe growing over the past years. And I just give you some recent numbers, and I leave Turkey out because there we have the highest increase of 10% in the last year. But in GP, in Great Britain last year, we had a plus of 4%. Whereas because of British Steel employees that was bankrupt, and also famous restaurants like Jamie Oliver, who also went bust. Italy, plus 6%. The rest of Central and Western Europe is plus 0.23%, just to give you an average. In Germany, Kreditreform has seen a slight decrease of insolvencies, but still questionable. The question of the energy issues and the German auto manufacturers is another separate thing, and this is probably when governments get involved in decision-making in enterprises, so we should leave that out first. Second, two more numbers with regards to trade, and I would like the panel, before they comment on each other and we open the floor to you, also keep that in mind. Is the so-called trade war, is this a true war if we look at the numbers? The trade, EU-US trade, and actually China and the EU trade is 4.6% of global trade. And the trade between China and the US is 4.3%. So what are the correlations if we look at that? So question mark, is this truly a trade war, or is it just a war of terms and verbs? Handing over to you, gentlemen. First come, first serve.
Well, to be sure, the comments have been far too rich and far too deep to do justice to them. Would you like a summary of each and then reacting to yours as well? It's a tremendous amount, but I will try and be brief. I thought Franz raised a terrific point regarding the necessity of structural reform. Monetary policy and fiscal policy can only do so much. And now the deepest of ironies is that monetary policy has already been used as a vehicle, and fiscal policy has as well. So it's questionable how much fiscal space is left, which leads us back to the structural reforms. I thought Michael made clear and compelling arguments regarding taxes and the effective use of those taxes. And part of that really relies on this idea that we need to engage the private sector to pick up the slack for the limits to the government. And I think, one of the things that we've seen is that the private sector has become an important contributor to economic output through the financial system, through banks, through corporations and individuals that want to use credit and build an economy, build a plant, build an equipment. So that's an important supplement to taxes. And Daniel's remarks were clearly thoughtful and provocative. The concept of an U.S.-EU free trade area is a very interesting one, and might be helpful. And then Barbara is always quite clear and provocative. Are we in a trade war? I don't think that we're in a trade war, but we're certainly experiencing trade discomfort. Just as the international monetary system has had these pressure points, so has the trading system. The international trading system has been unfair for many, many years. And there's a re-equilibration of that. I don't think that this is a trade war. I do think that there is trade discomfort. And then this interesting idea about an advance of insolvencies, I think it's because we're not growing. And it gets back to point one, we've got to get growth. We've got to engage the private sector to create growth. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Franz.
Sure, thank you very much. I would entirely agree with you, Lawrence, concerning growth and solvency. They're two things of the same coin, two sides of the very same coin. If we think about European growth, we have presumably a potential rate of growth, a juicy, a spicy rate of growth to the tune of, I think the ECB says 1%. Now, as economists, we usually would say, well, the error term is presumably to the tune of 0.5 percentage points. So you see basically how close we are to a kind of a recession if we look at the negative side of this coin. So to my understanding, the increase in solvency is basically a reflection, yes, you rightly mentioned, of lack of growth, but not only. There is also, as I mentioned earlier, on the lack of structural reform. And I can only insist on that and double underline that element. And I will use the German car makers. Think about cars. Of course, they make the most beautiful cars in the world, don't they? All right? Yet they missed a huge change towards whether it's electrical cars in the future or other hybrid cars, Wasserstoff, whatever that means in English. Hydrogen, thank you. So there's a mismatch between what we've been doing with great success and what we're going to do in the future. So to my understanding, an increase in the insolvencies is just a consequence of these two elements. And I'm quite surprised that the numbers aren't even higher. And when you started with the UK...
These are official numbers.
Of course. When you started with the UK, immediately I had Thomas Cook in mind. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm quite intrigued that the US is not yet in a similar situation, but obviously they're in a better shape, and in particular they are more responsive to changes. But let's leave that right there. So there are two elements for the insolvencies, basically lack of growth and lack of structural reforms. Trade war. Quite frankly, Barbara, I don't care whether we call it trade war or, as Lawrence put it, discomfort. I can only double underline, in a world of low, very low growth, a change in any kind of shock to the system may derail that feeble growth further. So whether the numbers are I think Daniel mentioned 1.9 trillion or something like that.
3 trillion.
It doesn't really matter. A small change can make a big difference and tip us back into a recession. And I'm quite intrigued by the fact that in Germany we talk about a technical recession in the manufacturing sector. Goodness gracious, I mean, this is quite an economist's jargon, right? Manufacturing sector is in a recession. If I look at industrial production in Germany, and the cars, again, they've been in a recession, i.e. negative growth rates, for 2 years now, even 3 years. That's quite a decent recession, isn't it? So the trade war, the word, to me, is basically meaningless. The change of this regime, and in particular, the threat, the menace of even more tariffs, that is, to me, the biggest threat. Of course, it's very popular, very, how should I say, enticing for journalists to talk about war because it's a fancy word. I hate it, but nevertheless, it makes headlines. That's what it's all about. But the change in the tariffs may derail growth. And that is the key element here. Whether we call it war, whether we call it jargon, doesn't really matter. The change is what is important. And indeed, that gives us quite some discomfort, Lawrence, if we look at growth, again, looking through the magnifying glass, because that's the only way we can see growth here in the Eurozone. Sorry for that lengthy statement.
That's fine. Michael will speak much faster then.
Yeah, yes, I totally agree. It's not a war, but if you look to growth, if you go to the webpage, we did one research, and it's not our figures. We always use independent figures, OECD figures, so it's much better than if you do a comparison. Some left-wing associations do their own research. We use public figures. That's really fair and clear. The highest growth on the European level, we have about 1%, in the Eurozone too, so we have our growth is not too high. But if you look in the detail, these countries like Ireland, Malta, Poland, and so on, those with low corporate income tax had the highest growth. And we did years ago, I could copy it and with new figures. Professor Richard Fetter, you will find it also on our webpage, did the research, and you can do it yourself on the OECD figures. If you have high taxation, you will have low economic growth. If you have low taxation, high economic growth. We did it 3 times. I financed this study, and it always was the same result. And then for me, it's clear, because if you want to invest, if you ask me to pay 50%, I have to think about, like in Germany, I have to think about to minimize my tax pressure, income tax pressure. If I pay 15% flat or 10% flat, like in Bulgaria, I do not think about it. I do not even think about it. So we need the right climate for entrepreneurs, and that's what we do not have in Germany. And for what I missed before, the basic pension now in Germany should be financed. It's a so funny story with the financial transaction tax, which is not existing yet in Germany. But it's a main part how to finance this gift for the next election. It's crazy and stupid. And so we need different approach. Like in Estonia, reinvested profits, it's a zero taxation. As long as you keep your money working in your corporate, you have a zero taxation. And Commission says it's unfair. I think it's very smart. If you take the money out, you should be taxed. But as long as you keep it in your corporate, and so what you're talking about, startups, and I'm also an entrepreneur, and if some people pay the invoices, what is happening? I pay for this year, I pay for the last year, for the next year. So if you are a startup in Germany, it's a really bad situation. If you're weak, if you have only debt, the finance control says it's a hobby. You should stop your things because you have no interest to make profits. But if you have profits, you are overtaxed. So let's think about how to solve the problem in the corporate, own capital and reinvested profits, tax-free is a very smart approach. And I wish Kurz good luck, that he will succeed against the Greens, because that was in the old program, and I would be happy to have it. Then Slovakia will follow, and then the Germans will follow, because it's a very smart idea. And go to the web page or look what is happening in Estonia. They did a great job with this reinvested profit tax-free.
Thank you. Daniel, last round before I open the floor.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, it's time for gifts. It's almost Christmas, therefore I think it's very good to talk about gifts right now, especially from the government that makes money and can just redistribute it. That's how it works, right? Structural reforms. Unfortunately, the debate is not about the structural reforms I think that you and I would like to see. Structural reforms are rather going in a completely different direction. There is the question about the system at the moment that is debated. We're talking about how to get rid of this bad capitalist system, or how I like to call it, market economy, and in favor of something else. It's more just, that is more fair, and that is unfortunately the structural debate that we have in a lot of places, instead of talking about reform of the pension system. I don't like the Social Democrats particularly in Germany, but nonetheless there was the Agenda 2010, where they reformed dramatically the social welfare system after the Danish flexicurity model, which I think was very smart, and it's still the key reason why Germany is still competitive. And they want to turn back the clock. And at the moment, indeed, and Michael said it earlier as well, we don't have an income problem, we have a spending problem in most of the places. More and more, and I think that also goes in direction a little bit what Bretton Woods, not Bretton Woods, but WTO is doing. There are more and more topics that need to be taken care of. We need to spend money on climate change, we need to spend money on this, we need to spend money on that. All of a sudden, everything is seen as a problem that needs to be solved by bearing it with money. Instead of letting market mechanism and experiments take care of the issue, no, we have one solution that we need to invest in, and therefore, hopefully, it will be solved someday. This is not how it works. That's not how innovation works, and that's not how problem solving works. I mean, there's this very nice quote about insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I mean, at some point you should realize that the solutions that you have might not work. But yet again, Germany just was having this automotive conference, the automotive summit, and decided that there will be a higher premium for buying electric cars.
Stupid.
Well, where's the money come from? Everybody's saying, yeah, I don't have to pay as much money for my electric car. Well, you're paying it for the after all because you're paying taxes. Where do you think the money is coming from? And this enfranchisement of paying tax and things being paid for by the government, this is, I think, one of the key issues. Another key issue there is that in a lot of places, they are trying to govern the past instead of having reforms for the future. Saying, oh, it was so nice back in the day. Why don't we keep the industries that we have alive and instead of allowing them to invest indeed in the future? Michael mentioned the Estonian model of investment. That is not unfair. This is how competition works. You have a better idea, you implement it, therefore you have higher revenue, therefore you have higher gains. That's why I don't also understand the attempt on European level to harmonize taxes or to harmonize social welfare system. I mean, I lived in Bulgaria. Now I live in Belgium. I went from a 10% flat tax to 57% income tax. So that was not very nice. I can tell. Yeah, I know. Well, but I agree with your statement. If Bulgaria wouldn't have that low income density, a complete competitive advantage would be gone. And getting rid of that, it would be a tremendous fallacy. Just one thing about the trade war. It might not be a trade war. It might be just slapping each other in the face very hard every once in a while. But nonetheless, it is still stupid. It is stupid. The losses might not be that big, but that also means if you have losses, that means you don't have an increased gain. And basic math, I mean, if you have interest rate and then you have 2% more next year, well, then you have a 2% higher baseline. Am I wrong? So we are not only talking about losses, we are talking about not realized gains that we have. And this is something that is dangerous and that is stupid. Also, again, I would like to make my point again about standards. If we are not talking about joint standards between the United States and Europe now, if we don't realize a trade bloc with the United States rather soon, somebody else will do that. Somebody else, not naming any names, who's dramatically investing in Africa at the moment.
Or in Europe.
Or in Europe, and buying half of European companies, 16+1. I don't know if you are looking into that right now, but 16+1, the Chinese new Silk Road that is coming up. Because we're here in Austria, Hungary and train. When there was the massive investment in China in the Hungarian railway system, and thereby actually, buying itself into the heart of Europe. We should see that and we should do something about it. And this is only possible if we cooperate instead of slapping each other in the face.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please raise your hands for questions and also introduce yourselves, no comments, and tell me who you want to address the question to. We have the first one here in the first row, in the second, in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. In the first round, 6 questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Quick.
Erich Bittag, my name. Herr Jäger, you mentioned the problems in the German pension system. In Austria, we have nearly the even worse situation, maybe. But do you agree with me that the treaty, intergenerational treaty, Generationenvertrag, is already dead, and the public pension system has some kind of a pyramid game or a Ponzi scheme?
Okay.
We collect.
Second question, over there.
Yeah, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Question to the International Financial Center. We all know about the beauties and the perfections of the invisible hand and the spontaneous order generated by the free market show. We have been through that show for 50 years now, from the monetarist counter-revolution to 9/11 in Chile and the Chicago Boys in Chile, including two Austrians, Arnold Harberger and Christoph Haberler. For the past 50 years, the result were the most recent books, Danny Roderick, Globalization Paradox, Why Global Markets, States and Democracy Can't Coexist. And Joe Stiglitz is certainly not in danger of being called a communist. Yeah? And if there was one critique that he brought up concerning the free market was, the benefits that you are talking about are based on very simple rules. Perfect competition. Can you tell me any industry in the world that qualifies as perfectly competitive, whether it's finance, auto, pharma, etc.? No? Number two, nobody has been talking about, well, in terms of international finance, about the conundrum of the shadow banking system. The outstanding volume of over-the-counter derivatives is in the vicinity of $2.6 trillion, which is 20 times world GDP. And Amazon, Facebook, and consorts are running around and harvesting their profits tax-free in around 170 offshore financial centers. And there was not a single comment about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Third in the third last row. Over there, and then, yeah. Da hinten. We have two more here, and then Dr. Sandner is the sixth.
Quite challenging, isn't it?
For the first round. Well, I probably should take a seventh.
May I?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I had a question for Mr. Goodman. We saw the 2008 financial crisis spurring from a debt crisis, and then we should have learned a lesson not to leverage too much, and 10 years later, we see that corporate levels of debt, households levels of debt, and government levels of debt have exploded throughout Europe and the US. So the Fed and the ECB have poured trillions of dollars into the money markets, enlarging money supply, and still the ECB has systematically missed the target of the 2% rate of inflation. Okay? So, is this the final proof that the fiat money and the ECB Fed style central banking system has failed us? And also, what can we expect now as the new recession is coming? Thank you.
Thank you. The next question's over there.
Mr. Kadik, my name is Christoph Ledel, and I'm an Austrian financial advisor. In Austria, the civil code did away with slavery in 1811, and this Mr. Draghi imposed slavery back on us again. Keeping up a currency at any cost, quantitative easing, and the installation of European regulatory authority with absolute power mean expropriation and war against the European citizens. And all these authorities have more absolute power than the Austrian emperor in times of absolutism. As we voted to join the European Union, we wanted a union of citizens, not, and I repeat, not a unity of tyranny, of bureaucracies that abolished the free markets. Mr. Kadik, what can we do to get these free markets back again?
Okay.
Thank you. There was, well, then Dr. Sandner, please.
Sandner retired. I have two questions. The first to you, Mr. Goodman. I think when one is speaking of Bretton Woods, one should absolutely speak of the end of Bretton Woods. It was on the, we never forget it, on the 15th August 1971, Nixon destroyed Bretton Woods. Seen from today, Bretton Woods is a dream. So far, we are very far away from this very solid system created at Bretton Woods. Since then, we are in a fiat money structure, muddling through from one bubble to the next, bubble building up, bubble bursting. The biggest, naturally, being 2008, not the only one. And this goes on. We are muddling through. We are now in a muddling through system. And we had a very solid system. The French called it at the time, on the basis of Bretton Woods, there were the 30 glorious years. No glorious years since then. So my second point is, I don't know, maybe either to you, Mr. Kading, or to you, Mr. Wenzel, there was talk of the trade war. And naturally, one can discuss whether it's a war or not. It is an introduced expression, but there was no word whatsoever of the monetary war. And this war is at least as important as a so-called trade war. I don't agree with Mr. Trump in 99.99%, but when he was speaking on the fiddling around with the monetary side, I was once for a while agreeing with him. And one of the results of this monetary war is naturally the export results of Germany, which even in Germany are considered as unhealthy. So we are in midst of such a monetary war, and it should be finally done something to stop this curious war.
Okay, well, thank you very much. 5 minutes left. 4 people, 1 minute and 15 seconds each.
To the pension system, it's not that, but we have to talk to the younger generations. They have to do something. If I talk to my daughters, I misunderstood. Because now what Daniel said, we had this Agenda 2010 by Schröder, and the pension age was 67. We have an aging society, less young people, so there's only one alternative: lower pensions, or you have longer to work, or higher social security contribution. And all these things, no higher social contribution, are wanted by the socialists for sure, or should be paid maybe by the employer. And the age is cut down to 60, should go down to 60. So after 45 years, you have the right to go to be a pensioner. It's not possible. So we cannot finance it. It's not honest. It's not an honest system. With the basic pension, the problem is that we have low incomes, and those people have not contributed in the system. For sure, we need an alternative for them. But what is in the discussion, what was from the conservatives, poverty test. If you have a so-called medicine wife or professor's wife, he has a high pension, a lot of wealth, and she was not working, she's getting the same pension as a nurse or a hair cutter. And that's a wrong approach, what is now proposed by the socialists. It's wrong. It's a wrong example because that makes people angry. Okay? And the fair tax, someone was saying something about the fair tax system. For sure, we expect fair taxation. But it's not true that Amazon is not paying taxes. I can show you the figures. The guy in the third row, I can show you the figures. And for sure, if you have value, if you register your corporate, you have to pay your taxes. They pay in Augsburg, Amazon. And you have to look how many jobs they created. It's not true. It's for sure in Ireland it was a misuse, but in total view, they pay taxes. And also in maybe the colleague from US can tell us, for sure the big corporates, digital corporates pay taxes.
Thank you. Daniel?
Okay, slavery. That's an easy one. Well, you don't have to go to the European Union. Look at how you are treated as a tax subject. There is no talk about that you actually earn to make a living, that you work to make a living. There's only the question always, how much people can take away from you when you get taxed. That makes you, for a lot of politicians, a tax subject. Then we deduct the tax, and that makes you a subject. So there is a problem that I see with the issue of self-ownership here, that you cannot I mean, 10% as a service fee, I can live with that. 57%, that makes me indeed, again, a tax subject. So for that, as well as for the level of the European Union, it is not so much the European Union that is a problem, it's the member states that are the problem. I mean, where does the initiative come from? It comes from the Commission and it comes from the Council. Let me remind you who sits in both institutions. In the Council, it is the heads of the member states or the respective ministers. In the European Commission, there are people who have been appointed by said member states. So again, it is a decision by the member states, by the democratically elected governments of said member states. So, again, the problem is not necessarily the European Union, it is the framework that has been created by said member states. That means unless we have a concrete reform by the European Union that goes in the direction of the Hayekian ideal of a global order, then we still have a problem. If we reduce the European Union to a clear set of rules and tell what we want with it, we might get out of the conundrum, but therefore we also need to get rid of the special interests that are posed by the member states. For instance, from Greece, that Greece needed to be saved, which was an interest, by the way, also from Germany, and especially from Germany, and coming to your question, has an interest of a low euro because it's undervalued for Germany, it's overvalued for Greece, quite obviously, which supports German export quite drastically and poses a long-term problem for European economy.
Thank you, Daniel. Franz?
I'll touch upon briefly on the great financial crisis and the debt level, which was addressed earlier on by a question. Indeed, as of today, I would say central banks and corporates have accumulated substantial levels of debt, which clearly is not sustainable. And earlier on we spoke about the bubble, which is at one stage going to explode and basically slap us, to use Daniel's wording, slap us in our faces. We cross fingers that central banks will not mess that part up, yet they came to a kind of borderline to doing basically government financing. And that's where we think they have no chance, no possibility to delve into that territory. Yet they're borderline. That's where we think central banks they're on the verge of having failed. So far, the alternative would have been, well, let's get rid of the euro, let's get an egg out of a thing which we called the scrambled eggs, quite difficult to achieve. Yet again, on the ECB, would be tempted to say they've done whatever was necessary. Today, they're on the verge. So in that respect, they are borderline to breach their mandate. And I will let Lawrence talk about the US Fed. That's not my territory.
Thank you very much, Franz. Larry?
I will answer the three questions. They're excellent questions. Thank you. They're extremely thoughtful and engaging. In terms of the shadow banking system, I agree. The shadow banking system is certainly something that needs to be measured and thought about. The monetary data that I was referring to earlier, we do that. And specifically, the biggest part of the shadow banking system relates to money market funds, repos, and commercial paper. They have actually been extremely helpful for the United States to have flexibility, and that's one of the reasons why for years the U.S. has grown, because of the flexibility of the financial system. In contrast, the European system is a little bit more ossified and focused on banking. So it's been helpful for the U.S. Unfortunately, before the 2008 crisis, the shadow banking system grew too fast. It needs to be monitored, measured. There needs to be transparency in the shadow banking system. In terms of the financial crisis, could go on for far too long for that. To be sure, though, trust broke down in the aftermath of 2008. Something had to be done. The authorities acted swiftly and thoughtfully in providing liquidity to rebuild that trust. Maybe they've gone too far. I do not believe that there's this proof that fiat currencies don't work. We just need to have limits in terms of understand the limits of monetary policy, and the system can work quite well with flexibility. Lastly, Bretton Woods. Thank you for the reference to the Nixon shock in 1971. That, to me, is proof that rules work. In fact, in 1971, the period before that, the United States was running an extremely large budget deficit while we were simultaneously engaging in a war in Vietnam and an increase of the Great Society, Great Social programs. We were running big budget deficits, and that was one of the contributing forces to the end of the Bretton Woods system. We can take that up. It's certainly an issue that budgets have expanded around the world. The United States does not hold the majority of the key on that, but it does show the limits of policy. We will never get back to a Bretton Woods. At least we're unlikely, very unlikely, to go back to that. But there are tenets that come from that kind of regime that's rule-based, that creates a strong and strong system, and we can certainly learn from that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This was, I think, well worthy